But let's start with vulnerability, and let's start with the willingness to be vulnerable, the willingness to really show up and let people in. How many of you were raised to believe that vulnerability is weakness? Most of us. Here's what I can tell you, and I'll challenge you. Yell up if you can think of something. I cannot find in 200,000 pieces of data a single example of courage that was not completely defined by vulnerability. Let me challenge you. Can you think of one courageous thing that you have seen someone do in your life that did not require vulnerability, that did not require uncertainty, risk, and emotional exposure? One thing. I find zero evidence. And let me tell you, I've stood in front of a group like this of special force military people. They can't think of a single example of courage that did not require absolute vulnerability. But we hate vulnerability because it opens us up to being hurt. And we think, I don't want to be vulnerable because vulnerability, here's my slideshow, there it is the center of shame and scarcity and fear and anxiety and grief and disappointment. So I am going to armor up and self-protect. I'm not going to let people hurt me, see me, take advantage of me. The problem is that when we armor up like that, not only is vulnerability certainly the center of these experiences, it's also the center of these: love and belonging and joy. No vulnerability, no love, no belonging, no joy. What do you think is the most vulnerable human affect we experience? What's the hardest emotion for us to handle as humans? Joy. And I'll just share this with you. What was the one variable men and women who had the capacity to lean heavily into joy? What was the one variable they shared in common? This should be a pedagogy of itself. What is the one variable that people who can really lean into joy share in common? It is part of vulnerability, but it's actually a practice. Gratitude. The only variable that really separates men and women who cannot lean into joy, who start dress rehearsing tragedy, and the reason we dress rehearse tragedy is so we can beat vulnerability to the punch. So what we do is like, oh, this great thing's happening. I'm gonna start picturing worst case scenario so that when I get hurt and it happens, I'm all prepared for it, right? But how many of you think we can actually prepare for that? You cannot. 50% of the people in this room have probably experienced the thing that we dress rehearse, and they could come up here one at a time and tell you, you can practice that all you want. That will do nothing to help you when that moment comes. The only thing you're doing is squandering the joy that you need that builds a reservoir for when hard things happen. So as it turns out, our bodies really neurobiologically experience joy as vulnerability and threat, and we quiver. And so some of us use the quiver as a warning sign to start thinking about terrible things, and others use that quiver as a reminder to be grateful, to stop on the sidewalk in that moment and say, I'm really grateful for this date night. I'm grateful for you. I'm grateful for our time together. But that's harder, right? Than to go, have you ever pictured someone? So love, belonging, and joy, absolute vulnerability. But also these things: courage, empathy, trust, innovation, and creativity. No vulnerability, no innovation, no creativity. No vulnerability, no creativity, no innovation. Accountability, adaptability to change, hard conversations. I mean, this is an easy question. How many of you think where you work, your school, your district, your grade level, how many of you think where you work would be better if people had a stronger skill set about having real, honest, respectful, hard conversations? Yes or no? Yeah, everybody. We dodge those and they become toxic in our culture. Feedback, problem solving, and ethical decision making all require vulnerability. How many of you in this room right now have ever tried to make an ethical, right decision in the face of a group moving the other direction? You will piss off some people. Yes or no? There's probably nothing more vulnerable than standing up in front of a group of people that you respect, that you work with, that you like, that you feel a sense of belonging with, and saying, this is not the right thing to do. So vulnerability is the birthplace of everything we want more of in our lives. The problem is that we end up here. Instead of having an open heart, we end up with a closed heart. We end up with a protected heart for a lot of different reasons. Some of them are environmental. Let me tell you this for sure. The greatest casualty of trauma is vulnerability. The worst thing we lose in trauma is vulnerability. And let's be very clear about what constitutes trauma. Racism is trauma. Poverty is trauma. Classism, trauma. Homophobia, heterosexism, trauma. And so the biggest casualty of that is I can't be vulnerable. Well, when vulnerability, the ability to really be who we are, becomes a realm of only the privileged, we have lost our capacity to create a school, a home, and a country that we love.